The more we dive in, the worse it sounds, which means the more I drink.
All right.
Hello, team, and welcome to Beerocracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross. I'm very excited today because I have Kevin Welner with me, who's the director of the National Education Policy Center in Colorado. Kevin, thank you so much for being here today.
It's my pleasure.
So we're going to be talking about the potential dismantling of the Department of Education, which is awesome. Kevin doesn't drink, and we applaud that, but I do. So I'm having a Bud Light because nothing says quality like Bud Light. And this feels synonymous to our education system. But Kevin, do you have a favorite beverage today, or are you just drinking water?
This morning when you asked me about time to record, I said I was busy. Really, I looked outside and it was beautiful, and I decided to go on a bike ride into the mountains. So this is recovery water. I'm just rehydrating.
Good for you.
That also explains my voice, because I think I strained myself a little bit.
Yeah, no. Allergy season's hitting us all. Cheers. Okay. Tastes. Okay.
The afternoon was also better because it prevented you from morning drinking. So,
it did. And that I appreciate. And my everyone around me appreciates. So thank you.
There you go.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? And the question I always love to ask is, why should we trust what you have to say?
I guess the most honest answer to that is you shouldn't.
Love it. That's my favorite answer.
In the sense that you should listen to what I have to say, hopefully, and listen with some skepticism, because I think that's always good, no matter what someone's credentials are. My credentials in this case are, if we're talking about the law, I am a former lawyer, and I do a lot of work in the area of education policy and law. And to the extent we're talking about education policy and the Department of Education, it's something that I have secondary knowledge of, in the sense that I have not directly researched the founding or current status of the U.S. Department of Education, but it's the water I swim in. So what I would encourage you to do, I think either your hair moved or you have a cat behind you.
That is a dog who acts like a
dog.
cat.
There we go.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Just
Yes.
sort of a little unusual. So the Department of Education and what's going on in the Department of Education is something I've been writing and researching over the last several months for obvious reasons. But I would encourage your listeners to research further anything that I say that sounds unusual or suspect. I will also, in response to your question, I think that I will try to flag anything that veers away from my area of expertise, or where I say there is a controversy. I'll flag anything where there's a controversy.
And I appreciate that. There's nothing I hate more than misinformation. And I'm very honest on this podcast. I am very liberal. This is a very much a left-leaning podcast, but it also makes sure that no misinformation is spread, and everyone should absolutely do their own research and understand the biases of what's happening. So that's my disclaimer. Kevin, the Department of Education, an executive order was signed to dismantle it. For people who are not aware, it cannot officially be dismantled unless by an act of Congress. What does the Department of Education do? Why is it important? Is it important?
The Department of Education was created by legislation in 1979 and signed by President Carter. At the time, it was essentially a bipartisan act. There were 18, I want to say. In the Senate, I think there were 18 Republican co-sponsors, right? And there were some Democrats who voted against it, right? So it was not a Republicans against Democrats legislation. There have been many attempts along the way to close it since then, since 1979. There's been legislation introduced, and it's never gotten anywhere. In large part because Republicans did not align behind it. So the last time, I want to say it was either the last Congress or the Congress right before that, there was legislation introduced, and 60 Republicans in the House voted against closing the Department of Education. If that bipartisan support for the Department of Education disappears and the House aligns completely with what Donald Trump wants, then you still have a filibuster issue in the Senate. You'd have to have 7 Democratic senators decide they want to close it, and that's not going to happen. So that's why I and a lot of other people have been saying you're not going to get legislation through Congress to close it. Let me play a little bit with your wording there, because I think it's important in terms of the legal issues going on right now. So there's a legal question about whether it can be dismantled without an act of Congress. Clearly, it cannot be closed without an act of Congress. But what's been going on is a dismantling. And we have a handful of lawsuits now asking the courts to, and I'd love to get into this because I think it's fascinating, but asking the courts to decide whether hollowing it out is the same as closing it.
Interesting. Where are the lawsuits saying? Where are they at in the process?
Well, obviously, everything is brand new.
Yeah.
And so, in fact, I should have a disclosure here. I am the chair of the board of trustees of the Education Law Center, which is one of the law firms that has filed a lawsuit. Their lawsuit was filed yesterday in Maryland Federal District Court. The NAACP is the lead plaintiff in that lawsuit. But, again, is it hundreds of lawsuits now in response to what the what the administration has been doing? So it's hard to keep track.
They come out with some, in my respectful terminology, fuck shit every day. And
there
then
you go. I think that's the legal term. Yeah.
That is a legal term. Thank you so much. I'm glad you recognize it. And then lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. It's a game of cat and mouse. And kind of going back to why does the GOP want to dismantle it? What's important about it, and what does it manage?
But let me back up to 1979, and your question was essentially, what does the Department of Education do? By that time, by 1979, the federal government was already very involved in education. So the federal government was already doing data collection and research. You had the Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is the main K-12 funding coming from the federal government to the schools through the states. You had the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, which was passed in 1975. Sounds right? Yeah. So Title I is 60. I should say that the other one was 65. And that's the second largest K-12 program. So ESEA money is $18 billion, upwards of $18 billion. And IDEA is upwards of $14 billion a year. And so that money comes through. The biggest buckets of money coming through the U.S. Department of Education are student loans and Pell Grants, higher education, by far. So if you look at the money coming through, I think it's upwards of 70% of the money going through the Department of Education is for those programs. And those also pre-existed the Department of Education being formed. So those programs and other programs came into the current U.S. Department of Education through the legislation. So the legislation said, okay, well, we have IDEA, let's move it into the Department of Education. It was in the Health, Education, and Welfare, which is now called Health and Human Services. And you had these different buckets of money and programs, and then you also had the Office of Civil Rights that was brought within the U.S. Department of Education. So if you think about Title IX, Title VI, Section 504, the Americans with Disabilities Act, et cetera, these are anti-discrimination laws that have to be enforced by the federal government. And that job in terms of enforcing them with regard to colleges, universities, K-12 education, that falls on the Department of Education. This hollowing out that we discussed earlier has hit Office of Civil Rights extremely hard. They were already understaffed, and they closed a bunch of local regional departments and cut back on staffing in general. There's a real question as to whether they can do much of anything right now, particularly since Trump has them focused on, trans kids in bathrooms, right? So there's this real question about whether or not the U.S. Department of Education is carrying out its legislative duty with regard to a lot of things, including Office of Civil Rights. By the way, most of what Office of Civil Rights investigates in terms of complaints are disability-related claims. So a lot of the focus is on, DEI or CRT or something like that. But really, it's disability-related claims that they are focused the most on. And then the other big place that has been cut. I mean, a lot of big cuts. Right, so we didn't mention the numbers, but it's basically half the staffing is gone from the U.S. Department of Education. But the Institute for Educational Sciences, which is the institution, the branch essentially created by Congress to collect and analyze data, that's also been decimated. So there's a lot of what you might ask me about today in terms of numbers. That all comes, the best source of those numbers is the federal government. That's now, who knows how it will play out, but I don't see how they could collect all that information and analyze those data. They also contract out a lot to researchers around the country, and the Elon Musk Doge canceled a lot of those contracts. Yeah, I'm just full of good news. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. I'll take a sip of beer. What I found really interesting, and this was like just me being completely uneducated on it, but I was honestly surprised the fact that the Department of Education really provides no type of federal guide, like classroom education guidelines to the states. And that was something that I found very honestly shocking.
Mm-hmm.
Has that always been the case?
Yes. So okay. I don't detect an accent. I don't know if you were born overseas, but in a lot of places overseas, they don't
Chicago,
understand this
which,
either.
Tomato, but
okay. Right. Right. So if you were born overseas, you'd probably really think of what we do is strange. I've spoken with reporters from other countries, and you sort of have to start with that, understanding the way the Constitution was set up in the federalist system. So the U.S. Constitution does not give the federal government any role in education. Those roles are set forth in state constitutions, and while the federal government has played a role, it's not assigned any constitutional role. And the Congress has, through legislation at various points, told the U.S. Department of Education, or told the president, you shall stay out of curriculum. You shall stay out of curriculum and instructional decisions. And so the rhetoric that is attached by Donald Trump and Linda McMahon and others to this closing the Department of Education is about sending education back to the states, right? This idea that there shouldn't be a federal role.
And that's why I think I was confused, because they're not, education's already in the states. They're just providing them money.
Well, it's in the state, but there have been examples. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. That's just my understanding of the role of the Department of Education. And I was like, you want to get rid of the department that gives you a lot of money?
Well, there have been examples of federal overreach. And I know you identified your politics as liberal. You're probably a fan of Barack Obama and his administration.
Also mainly just Chicago, but yes.
There you go. But I will say that his administration overreached in terms of education. They did several things that Congress eventually pushed back on through some legislation, but in my judgment, they overreached and did try to micromanage, and it's probably too strong a word, but micromanage what was going on in terms of state educational policy. That doesn't mean they didn't have good reasons for doing it. In fact, I would argue that George W. Bush and No Child Left Behind also was an overextension, if not an overreach. Ironically, the current administration, the Trump administration, while making these rhetorical claims about sending education back to the states, is also trying to micromanage, right? So we have not just the higher education stuff that we're paying attention to in the news, right? So bullying, Columbia University, et cetera, into putting a department into receivership, for example, which strikes me as micromanaging. But also, there was, I believe, a vaccine, like a requirement that if schools put a vaccine mandate in place, they would withhold federal funding. This is one of those places where I'm going to say, I think, right? So just don't trust me completely. That's my recollection on that. But also, obviously, the mandates with regards to transgender children and bathrooms and athletics and whatnot. And then all the anti-DEI attempts to control what's taught in schools. And that is probably the subject of 2 or 3 lawsuits right there, right, in terms of that overreach. So at the same time, we have a rhetorical push to send education back to the states. There's this very muscular use of existing laws to try to control what's happening and
hypocrisy
and restrict
in this administration.
Your word,
Never.
not mine, Emily. Yeah. So I think that there is an inconsistency, an attempt to do 2 things at once that seem in tension.
Right. You're like, the math ain't mathin'.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, so I've read that the Trump announced that Pell Grants and the federal loans are going to be moved into the SBA, the Small Business Administration, under Kelly Loeffler, and like they're trying to put all these different pieces kind of not back where they came from, but in a way, like moving back to like the Health and Human Services, which I don't necessarily want RFK Jr. in charge, but if the department still kind of exists, I think that's okay, right? But if like the Department of Education were to be dismantled, but these sections that exist within the Department of Education still exist, is that a cause for concern?
So yes and no. We're focusing a lot on, there are a lot of directions I can go with this, but let me start here. We're focusing a lot on the educational harms being done, right? So what is this going to do to our state departments of education, to our school districts, to our schools? The simple answer there is chaos at the very least, right? It's a fairly smooth functioning system has now been thrown into havoc with very few people in the federal government around to help out. So there's that. But I think in addition to the harm to education questions, we need to be constantly asking the harms to democracy questions. So I mentioned these court orders that are coming down and the constitutional crisis questions that are being asked. And that's largely because of what happens if the Trump administration ignores court orders, right? So there's that. That's going on during all this time.
We're creeping pretty close to.
Yes. But at the same time, there's that question, the constitutional crisis question. Do I now have to drink the water?
No, you don't have. The more we dive in, the worse it sounds, which means the more I drink.
All right. So at the same time, there's this question about whether the court orders will be followed. We have this barrage of lawless action taking place. And so while the executive order says we acknowledge we can't close the department, what you just mentioned about moving some of this higher education stuff into the Small Business Administration, that's also lawless, right? It's just by the same, completely the same principle. You have Congress that set forth, the ESEA, IDEA, the Pell Grants, the student loans. Congress, when they created these things, placed them into the U.S. Department of Education. That's a congressional act. And for the president to simply say, no, I'm moving this, notwithstanding the law that's in place, is lawless. And that's also a crisis, to have these very overt. I mean, there's nothing secret about what's going on, right? This is very overt. We're going to do what we want to do, and we're going to keep doing it until you can stop us. And that's something, if we were sitting here looking at a country overseas doing it, we would sort of, shrug our shoulders and say, oh, they just don't understand how these things are supposed to work. That's not a functioning democracy.
Yeah, or we would send the CIA and run a covert operation to put who we want in power. But yeah.
Yeah, maybe we would. Maybe. We don't do that, No,
of course. Nudge.
So I think that there's a lot going on there that goes beyond the educational harms of a move like that. I'm sure there's already a lawsuit being prepared or filed, probably more than one, challenging that. And it's just going to be another one of those cases that has to work its way through. And ultimately, we haven't talked about the current U.S. Supreme Court, but there are a lot of people who don't have a great deal of faith.
On this podcast, it is a favorite topic. So from a legal standpoint, moving it is questionable. From a immediate harm done to an individual person, what effect would that have?
So again, I think the main damage is to our constitutional structure, just to be clear. But in terms of the educational damage, it's going to play out very differently, I think, in red and blue states. So you and I are in blue states, and the U.S., if the U.S. Department of Education neglects its duties, there are things that blue states, its congressional duties as imposed by Congress. There are things that blue states can do to step in to protect rights through anti-discrimination laws, to try to provide some of the lost funding, to the data issues are really tough because the federal role in data collection analysis is a national structure, right? And if we lose that, the fact that New York or Colorado might be collecting good data doesn't get us quite there, right? But in terms of the IDEA funding, that's going to be an issue in terms of just states having to come up with the funding that kids with disabilities need. But there's also an IDEA structure that's in state law. States adopt parallel laws to the federal IDEA. So if you think about an individualized education program, or a what is called the staffing meeting, where parents get together with people at the teachers and the school authorities to come up with an individualized plan for a student with disabilities. Other sorts of protections that are put in place about providing a free and appropriate education for students with disabilities. All those things can be provided for, and generally are already provided for in state law. The federal government, probably there's going to be a push to move IDEA money and Title I money into block grants. We're now getting into whether or not the Department of Education is closed. This is part of the Republican educational push. And
I did
that's going
see
to play
some
out.
Headlines about block grants. Yeah. And that would mean basically just giving a lump sum of money without any type of requirements of where it goes.
Yeah. So a completely no strings attached block grant would be, here's state, here's the money you would otherwise get under our old formulaic system that says these kids get IDEA money. Instead, here's your money and do with it what you will, within some limitations. Certainly the Title I money would be very likely to be given in that sort of way.
And for people that are not aware, Title I money is for low income and impoverished students.
Yeah, so that's schools serving students serving kids from low income families. Yeah.
Perfect.
So that'll play out differently. And then the higher education, no idea what's going to happen with that. Pell Grants are, I want to say it's upwards of 30% of kids going to college get Pell Grants. And loans are just slightly less than that. So we're talking about a huge, that's why the money is so large, right? Because this is how the federal government supports higher education. There's also an accreditation role that the federal government plays, and an enforcement role. So if you think about fraudulent activities, Trump University, for example, but organizations that have not treated students fairly, that is a role that the federal government has stepped in and litigated and closed down or enforced better behavior.
What about like Title IX stuff? Is that handled by the Department of Education?
Yeah, in fact, that's all the anti-trans stuff is relying on Title IX.
Got it.
So just to clarify, so Title IX is the anti-discrimination law that deals with sex discrimination. And we think most people know Title IX primarily because of the girls' athletics programs that are in K-12 schools, as well as higher education for the women attending college. And making sure that there are programs that serve people other than the boys and males. So the Title IX is enforced by OCR, Office of Civil Rights, as are the anti-discrimination laws to protect age discrimination, nationality discrimination, race, ethnicity, you name it, right? All the anti-discrimination laws. So And I should add, we talked about block grants. The other big Republican push is a major voucher plan. And virtually none of those anti-discrimination laws get carried over into private schools. Certainly private religious schools have a lot of walls that they could put up to prevent anti-discrimination laws from being applied.
Can you elaborate more on that? So at the current moment, the Department of Education does not give a lot of money to private and religious schools?
Right. So there's no federal voucher plan. There are lots of states that have voucher plans.
Got it.
New York and Colorado are not among them, but most states now, I want to say something like half of the, fact check that, of the states have voucher plans. And when I say voucher plans, there are a lot of different mechanisms that are used, but the idea is to take taxpayer money and use it to fund private education.
Got it. Okay. And so GOP is talking about making a federal program for that.
Right. So there are about 1 million kids across the country who receive vouchers right now to attend private school. And the plan being proposed by Republicans in Congress would double that and double it through a federal program. It's a federal program that would be funded through tax credits. It's a fairly complex mechanism, but it's basically just federal money going to support a voucher plan. That would, by the way, apply to Colorado and New York, right? So even though our voters and legislators have rejected vouchers again and again and again, in part because of that anti-discrimination issue I mentioned. We don't want taxpayer money funding discrimination against kids. But that rejection in places like New York and Colorado would be essentially overridden by a federal program that would fund kids in our states to go to private religious and private schools.
Interesting. Very interesting. So what I'm hearing is, regardless of the legal claims and issues, right, of whether or not it's legal for the Trump admin to be doing this, the main issue, it appears to be, is the cutting of these people that work within these systems and are able to provide this support to states. If the Department of Education were to be dismantled, but every element within it rehomed in a way without cuts, it would be okay.
You'd lose well, we've already lost expertise because of the firings, but the thinking of moving, you mentioned RFK, and I forgot the Small Business Administration. Kelly Loeffler. So if I'll use RFK because I know who that is. I know more about him. So if RFK is in charge of most of the programs that we're talking about, using Title I as the most obvious, if he's in charge of that and his expertise is on, I'll say vaccines, but it's sort of a weird sort of expertise, but it's something he cares about, right? Or right. Healthcare in general, or actually he's also focused on like healthy foods, for example.
Right. Which, by the way, I believe the Department of Agriculture cut a ginormous grant that gave healthy foods to schools and worked with local farmers.
I think I saw that too. Yeah.
By the way,
but he's not in charge of the Department of Agriculture. But you get the idea that if he's in charge of something that he has no interest or knowledge in, I'm speaking very theoretically here, and I'll explain why in a second. But the idea is that you would want expertise in people who know these programs to be in charge of the programs. Now,
I love that idea, but have you seen the recent Trump administration?
Well, I mean, that's why I was laughing, because I don't know if you know, but there was an interview with Linda McMahon on Fox News after she had started dismantling. I think it was the day after she had fired all these people. And she apparently knew enough about the department 6 days in to know that half the people weren't needed. But she didn't know, I've been talking about IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. She didn't know what IDEA stood for in this interview. And she used the excuse, I've only been on the job for 5 or 6 days. She knew enough to get rid of all those people because apparently they weren't needed. So setting aside that critique of the focused expertise that I said should be in the Department of Education, there are certainly underneath the career the career people who were let go did have a great deal of expertise in their areas. Pretty much the most expertise in their areas. And now they're gone. They're scattered to the wind.
That's a bummer. And like you said, it's going to really depend on red and blue states, depending on if students of like ESL, which is like English second language students, and students with disabilities, like are able to get fair and equal education, and then also then going up to Pell Grants and student loans, there's already such a massive issue of college-age students being preyed upon by student loan people, like who's going to advocate for them? And then like, who's going to, and there's certainly not going to be any student loan forgiveness. That's for sure.
Who's going to just answer questions about eligibility? I mean, just even those basic things. I mean, you mentioned English learner students. My understanding is that department within the Department of Education is down to one person.
That's insane. That's crazy. Yeah. That's absolutely crazy. And from what I understand, the Department of Education is the smallest cabinet.
Even before the cuts. Yeah. So it had 4,000 people before, about 2,000 now. So even when it was 4,000, it was the lowest head count of all the cabinet level departments.
Great.
So it's very small. It was small, and now it's very, very small. Yeah.
And from what I've understood, about states receive about 20% of their education funding from federal government.
No, it's closer to 10. You actually will see figures. Someday I'm going to figure out why these are all. I think it's probably something dealing with the different denominators, but you'll see figures anywhere from 8 to 13%. So you could use 10 as a rough.
We'll use 10. Okay. So it's a small amount, but it's the organization that advocates for those that need the most care and fairness.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it should.
Right.
You'll see, the other argument you'll see a lot is, in fact, I think was in the press release or in the executive order, that we've been putting more and more federal money in and we don't see better results. I don't know if you've seen this also.
I did see that.
Okay. And let me ask you, here's a little, I just did these calculations the other day. So now I'm going to put you on the hot seat.
Oh gosh.
So if you think about the, not sleeping time, but the waking time of a child through the time they're graduating from high school at 18, what percent, and let's assume they go to preschool for a year, what percentage of their waking hours do you think they spend in school?
So let's say they get 8 hours of sleep, which is a third of 24, right? So they're awake 66% of the time. And then if you subtract that 18 minus 5,
7.
Right? Something like that.
Well,
18 minus 5 is 13.
What is the 5 for? What does the 5 represent?
Oh, guess when they don't start preschool?
Oh, okay.
That's like kindergarten.
Got it. Okay.
Can you finish this? I'm struggling.
You're mixing hours with years, so you confuse me there.
Anyways, they spend a lot of hours at school.
Do you want to just come up with a seat of your pants guess that can be fact checked?
Yeah. How many hours they spend at school? Or
what percentage? What percentage of their waking hours by the time they graduate from high school?
50%. 45, 35, 33, 20%, 10%, 5%.
Depends on a lot of specifics that you would have, but it's basically 15 and 16%. But that if you bring together the 15, 16%, or even 17% if you want to really be generous at the most extreme level, with the claims about, well, look, our kids aren't learning enough. And the huge body of research, please fact check me on this, because this you will find that I'm correct. the huge body of research on the role of poverty, and in this country, racialized poverty, in driving opportunity gaps and the achievement gaps or test score gaps that we see. It all starts to come together and make sense that we are starving our schools, but we're also starving our kids outside of schools. And those results that you see are, the federal government put a little bit more money into this program or that program, and it's not showing up in test scores. There's the argument. It does, by the way. But, we have lots of research showing that money matters and resources matter for kids. But if you think about IDEA, if you exclude kids with disabilities from school and don't educate them versus bring them in and provide supports and educate them, which A or B is going to have the highest average test scores at the end? If I take out a bunch of kids that have learning disabilities, for example, and don't test them, my average scores are going to go up. So we're putting money into schools and we're doing great things for kids by having them in school. And we're providing lots of educational opportunities. But if you're measuring the outcome based on average test scores, you're going to see a decrease by having those kids in school. So it's the cause and effect argument is really sloppy. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating for researchers up and down the coast.
I can only imagine. And especially test scores being the end all be all. And
well, that's the other thing. Yeah.
That's a whole big thing. That would require a whole other podcast.
That's a separate program. Yeah. But right. Yes, test scores measure, there are some really crappy tests, but even good tests measure only a slice of what we care about.
Right. Kevin, any last things you want to touch on?
Keep your eye on the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
and the response of the administration to these. I actually don't know how the federal court system can swallow all these cases.
We talked about it in a recent episode.
Is that right?
That the courts, my previous guest was like, the courts are designed to work really well if you give them 3 to 5 years to work through all this, not when you have this many at this short amount of time. And so this is obviously by design.
Yeah. It's overwhelming. It's overwhelming for all of us for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
And that's what drives you to drink. Huh? So.
Always an excuse to drink. Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Appreciate unpacking it all and providing more insight about a very, very interesting and uncharted territory.
It is, which is actually goes back to your question about why you should trust me. Honestly, we've never done this before.
Right.
When I was first interviewed about closing the Department of Education, I didn't even think of the possibility of hollowing it out. Right. I wasn't that creative. So. Or dystopian creative. Or whatever. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, it's hard to predict what's going to happen with this because this is all uncharted.
Right. We'll see. Well, Kevin, thank you so much. And I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week with another episode of Bureaucracy.